Well, I'll introduce you. Are we okay with starting? I'll go ahead and start. Hi, I'm Peter Schwartz. I'm the director of the IU Center for Bioethics. And for this talk, I'm most importantly the director of the Bioethics and Subject Advocacy Program of the Indiana CTSI. And this is our next version of our TREATS talks, Translational Research Ethics and Applied Topics. We present these roughly monthly and often taught by one of our faculty members in the BSAP program. And Jane is absolutely one of those. She's been a long-standing BSAP faculty member as well as a faculty investigator at the IU Center for Bioethics. We are lucky and proud to have Jane, to count her among our crew. Her day job, though, is to be the director of clinical and organizational ethics for the Academic Health Center at the Fairbanks Center for Medical Ethics at IU Health. And I learn from Jane all the time, not just when she's teaching my classes, if she's a guest lecturer, but also whenever I talk to her. And so I'm sure we all will learn from her today. The TREATS talks are all archived on our website. Somebody, maybe Todd, could put that into the chat if you want to go see. Well, not that you won't be, I mean, you'll be paying full attention to Jane, I know. Professor Hartsock. And so you'll be faithful, but you might want to see our TREATS page, which now has all the previous TREATS talks. So these are the ones in the last few years with resources attached and a description. And so you can see where the resources are and you can direct other people to them if you'd like. We're very proud of that. I've worked hard to improve that. Maybe we'll put that, I can put that in the chat or Todd can. Okay, and so with no further ado, I am thrilled to have Professor Hartsock talk to us about authorship. She's spoken to us about that before. She's going to give us an update and perhaps some additional pointers. So thanks, Professor Hartsock.
All right, I'm going to share my screen, which is always the most stressful part of any presentation these days. But hopefully that will work well enough.
But I'm going to be the bad guy here and say people who can turn on their camera, feel free to. You don't have to. It's always more fun to have cameras on. We were talking about teaching in person versus over Zoom. If you're eating lunch or doing something you don't want to have guests with you, that's fine. But we do appreciate when cameras are on. Hi, Jeff. Thanks.
All right, so I should be sharing only one slide. And so if I'm not, somebody can text me furiously and let me know. Okay, so as Dr. Schwartz said, I am Jane Hartsock. I'm a faculty investigator with the IU Center for Bioethics and have some other fun roles that I play here on campus. This will be our TREATS talk on authorship. I have tried to center my talk around some of the publishing issues that have come up in the context of the COVID publishing frenzy of the past year and a half or so. And I've done that just to make it sort of relevant to people, or particularly interesting, maybe, hopefully, to people. But really, much of what we talk about today applies to just authorship in any time. It's just that COVID seems to be good at revealing existing issues and inequities in medicine, and it does that in authorship as well. So it serves as kind of a nice example of much of what we will discuss. So I have two primary objectives for our conversation today. The first is to go over the general guidelines for calling oneself an author. This is in keeping with the TREATS talk mission of providing easily accessible, straightforward answers for our researchers. And the second subtopic will dive a little bit more into some of the ethical obligations for authors, and we'll spend a bit of time discussing how COVID has changed publication norms, whether that's good, bad, or not anything at all. I'll also say, in the spirit of our TREATS talks, that the two papers or resources that will probably be the most helpful to our researchers if they want to follow up and read more or just have quick access to this include the Icmje guidelines on defining the roles of authors and contributors, which you can access online, and the Authorship in Scientific and Academic Research paper written by Kenneth Pimple in 2012, which is almost 10 years ago now, but it's still a really comprehensive, detailed discussion of what we will discuss today and issues beyond that. So when I teach authorship to some of our grad students as part of the IUCB graduate courses, I also focus on the whole process of generating a scholarly manuscript, including an overview of the peer review process, and I provide a really comprehensive discussion on plagiarism, since there are so many learners who are participating in that course. And I'm I'm not necessarily going to do that in as much detail as I usually do. And just sort of anecdotally, I think people like to focus on these really big ticket authorship problems like falsification of data, or what Ken Pimple terms culpable as opposed to technical plagiarism. But I think the problems you're much more likely to encounter are probably going to be simple academic pettiness, the failure to list an appropriate author, the failure to include, or the insisting on including inappropriate authors in manuscripts, games with authorship order, those kinds of things. And so we'll talk a little bit about that as an ethics issue. So just really briefly, I will say a few words at the front end about research misconduct. There are three primary categories of research misconduct that are important to authorship. They are fabrication of data, falsification of data, and plagiarism. I don't know that I need to go into these in really extensive detail, but fabrication of data is obviously creating studies that you didn't actually do and publishing them. Falsification of data would be a good example of that, is the Andrew Wakefield studies on the connection between autism and MMR vaccine. And then plagiarism is copying, and not just copying, but not just your sort of cut and paste copying, but stealing ideas, synthesis, concepts, those kinds of things that are not of your invention. And so just as a sort of general rule, the reason these things are bad is because they are essentially, matters of dishonesty, presenting work that you didn't do or work that is not yours. And so we should not do that, just as a general rule. So I want to go over the sort of criteria for authorship. What does one have to do to consider themselves an author? As I said at the beginning, these criteria are set out by the International Committee of Medical Journal Editors, which is a committee that has standardized ethical criteria for submission and publication of scholarly manuscripts. This is not the only authority on criteria for manuscript submission, but it is the dominant one in science and medical journals. So satisfaction of Icmje criteria is required for submission to the New England Journal of Medicine, the Lancet, JAMA. And so if we've got those big players embracing these criteria, that we can consider them kind of important criteria. So the four criteria are substantial contribution to the conception or design of the work, drafting of the actual manuscript, reviewing it for critical or important intellectual content, and then approval of the final version to be published with an agreement to be accountable for all aspects of the work. I think that it is worth discussing, maybe we can do that kind of at the end of our conversation today, but I think it's worth discussing whether this is an appropriate standard in today's research world, to require that every single person on a research team have done all of these things in order to consider themselves an author. I do think this kind of ignores the modern team-based approach, multidisciplinary team-based approach to research that tends to rely on the individual strengths or weaknesses of individual members of the team. And it also doesn't acknowledge different cultures of publishing that are sort of discipline specific, where it might be a norm to have, somebody included as an author who, for example, did not contribute to the conception of the manuscript, but came in, after as a sort of, strong writer or interpreter or researcher, that kind of thing. So in any case, and for the time being, these are the guidelines, and adherence to them is likely to be required by you at some point in time if you are involved in scholarly publication in biomedical sciences. It's also important to remember that the second clause here is that all who meet the four criteria should be identified as authors. I think we tend to be concerned in the ethics of authorship about people being included as authors who shouldn't be, and maybe need to give a little bit of attention at least to people who should be included as authors and are sometimes frozen out. That's actually something that the Icmje has cautioned specifically against, freezing people out for purposes of making it impossible for them to satisfy all four criteria. Of course, if somebody does not satisfy all 4 criteria of authorship, they may satisfy criteria for an acknowledgement. So here are some examples of the kinds of participation that may merit an acknowledgement: general supervision of the research, writing assistance, technical editing, language editing, proofreading. I think it's kind of funny that a lot of this has to do with people who compensate for maybe weak writers on the team, but they deserve an acknowledgement. And much like authorship, it's also important here that if somebody satisfies this criteria, they should be placed in the acknowledgements section. Ken Pimple, again, kind of downplays the significance of this. I think he says something like, only your mom cares if you're included in an acknowledgement. I'm not sure that's true. If someone has given a substantial amount of time to help you get your article published, you should say thank you. And in academics, this is where you do that. So as I mentioned at the beginning, increasingly publishing is taking place by multidisciplinary large teams, large research teams. And so there are problems related to multiple authors, and those things require sort of more and more attention, I think, these days. It's important to note that the Icmje does not grant an exception to their sort of like all 4 criteria standard, even in cases of very large research groups or multi-institution projects. So the table here is actually from several years ago, noting the overall trend towards an increasing number of authors on journal articles. Some of these are kind of funny, the idea of there being 3,179 authors on a single publication. I will note that most of these are physics publications, though, which I understand is a discipline with its own set of cultural norms with respect to authorship. But genomic medicine is becoming somewhat analogous in terms of the number of individuals who may have meaningfully participated in the generation of a manuscript. So there's a pretty good paper, and short too, by Hammer and Myskowski that comment specifically on this within the genomic medicine, the precision medicine context, and note that there is a sort of team-based approach to that research that can sometimes include tens or even hundreds of individuals. So while the previous table was sort of unique to physics, increasingly we're starting to see that same issue develop within medicine. And so the question becomes, if you have an article with 112 people on it, have they really satisfied all 4 of those criteria? And if they haven't, I mean, should they necessarily have, or is that becoming a kind of antiquated, over-restrictive hurdle? So I do want to take some time to talk about some of the challenges that arise in publication of manuscripts. These are sort of particular ethical pitfalls, we might think of them. I already discussed research misconduct, but 3 issues that probably require specific discussion include what we call gift authorship, a ghost authorship, and then specifically faculty-student collaborations. So gift authorship is the granting of authorship to somebody who was not really instrumental to the production of the manuscript. They might not even be somebody who necessarily satisfies the criteria of even an acknowledgement. Sometimes this is like a department head or the owner of the lab, that kind of thing, or the person who runs the lab is included as an author when they are not really necessarily, they don't fit the criteria for that. Sometimes you can also see gift authorship as an attempt to increase the chances of publication. So if you have 2 junior authors writing and they think their chances of publication might increase by including on that manuscript the person in their department who is nationally recognized, et cetera, and that person didn't really have anything to do with the manuscript. Those are examples of gift authorship, and they are ethically impermissible. You are not supposed to do that. Ghost authorship is the sort of flip side of that, where I guess the best example of this would be, for example, a pharmaceutical company that wants to have an article published that shows, wonderful benefits of its newest statin or something like that. And so they write the article and then have it published under the name of somebody else so that it appears to be neutral and sort of academically generated, when in fact it was written and generated by a pharmaceutical company. So that's also ethically impermissible. So I always feel a need to give us a special sort of supportive conversation about our faculty-student collaborations, because I do think, and I hear quite a bit from students and former students and colleagues about the sort of exploitation and misunderstandings that can occur within this area. And Ken Pimple does a nice job talking about faculty-student collaborations as a particular risk too. So some of the biggest problems in that area include that students really don't know what to expect from publication, particularly if it's their first rodeo. And they rely on us as mentors to kind of protect their interests and guide them. And some of the little horror stories that I've heard from students over the year include everything from a student who substantively participated in drafting various chapters in a book that was written and was then relegated to an acknowledgement section, all the way to students who are eliminated from papers altogether that they've written. There are also obviously problems with students who are placed in middle author position, or students who are caught in the middle of faculty, fighting about authorship position, and all of that is just very much inappropriate. I try to think of working on a manuscript with a student, as having sort of two objectives. The first is the production of the manuscript, and the second is the learning by the student. So while the work is likely to be much more involved when you're publishing with a student, although not always, that work is sort of your scholarship overhead, right? That the labor of working with a student. So you should factor that into the collaboration on the front end. So I want to focus a little bit on some of the authorship issues that come up a lot, but have come up a lot in COVID publishing. So a lot of this has to do with the sort of speed to publishing and the volume of publishing related to COVID during this time. So just for context, just so that, I'm being kind of balanced here, I think it's important to acknowledge that the need for shared information is real during this pandemic, and the ability to quickly share that information globally has undoubtedly led to improved outcomes for patients, the development of better treatment, mitigation, and vaccination strategies, and the quickness with which we've been able to accomplish those things. So there's a real value there. So I think of the early, we're like a year into all of this now, but the early understanding that ventilators were not as effective as like BiPAP and CPAP, that was something that was shared very early on and led to better patient outcomes. The advantage of proning was something that was shared by Italy really, really early on in the pandemic. And then all of the conversation around masks and our increasing consensus and understanding of about the fact that masks work and how in mitigating transmission. So the peer review process has sped up during this time, and probably necessarily so, but I really like this quote from London in a recent science article in Science about, the old model for like 6 months to publication is just not going to work during a pandemic, and it certainly hasn't been the norm here. So some of this is good, right, because it helps us share information quickly, but some of it is bad. And so there are some examples of real problems from aggressive over-publishing. And I'm going to do my Kai Rizdal impression here and go by the numbers. We've seen a massive increase in submissions to journals, 270,000 more articles just to one publisher. Submissions to health and medicine journals increased by 92%. There were more than 100,000 articles about COVID published in 2020 alone. And 10% of those were, 10% of preprints in 2020 were on COVID-19. So huge increase. And I like to think, because I'm Gen X, I like to think of this somewhat like the early days of Napster, right? When it was really cool that you could get a paper or get a song easy and early and whatnot, but sometimes you didn't know what you were downloading. And the file that you got when you downloaded was not the song you wanted, or was just a really bad song that you thought you might like and you did not. And so that's kind of what's going on now with the COVID publishing, that it's great that we have access to it, but sometimes what you're getting is not very good. So some of the examples of this are funny and entertaining, right? So commercial disinfectants should not be administered orally or subdurally. That was kind of an early joke about misunderstanding some of the research on fomite transmission. But some of it's very real and has had really negative impacts on patients. So I think of the controversy over hydroxychloroquine as a really good example of sloppy publishing, fast publishing during the pandemic. And I think it's easy for us to think of this as just, a sort of a publishing area problem. But this whole mess had a really negative impact, particularly on patients with autoimmune disorders like lupus, because the demand then for hydroxychloroquine by patients who believed it would help COVID reduced its supply for patients who actually can benefit from hydroxychloroquine, like patients with lupus. And so, so these are not sort of abstractions in terms of the effect of publishing on overall patient health. There is a website where you can actually follow the number of retractions that have been made during the COVID publishing frenzy. And to date, they are at 104 full retractions. They have other categories of articles that have been sort of criticized or whatnot. It would probably help, this is a total aside, but my background is in law, and I would love it if PubMed would develop a shepherdizing function the way Westlaw has, where an article has a green, a yellow, or a red next to it, and you can see all of the articles that have published it or that have cited to it. I think that would be great, pipe dream. So anyway, lots of retractions. Some of these are really silly retractions. There's an article out there about whether a cat is better at recognizing COVID than AI, and that article was formally retracted. I don't know that I care, but some of the retractions have been obviously much more consequential. So another issue that I wanted to make sure to discuss in COVID publishing has been the way it has exposed gender inequity in publications. So, so the gender representation of authors during COVID publishing. This graph on the left-hand side of the screen is what employment numbers looked like for women and men during the summer, during this past summer. And this is the percent of adults of childbearing age who were not working due to COVID-related childcare issues. So we see a sizable number of people there who are not working. And this is consistent, with a pattern that has persisted through COVID. There was an article, I think CBS online published an article about the fact that 275,000 women left the workforce just in January of 2021. That's compared to 71,000 men. So it's a huge number. And that has played out in academia as well. So just again, some of the numbers, publications for both men and women are up, consistent with the COVID frenzy that we have seen with publications. But publications that include women are lagging behind those where there are men-only teams. And publications that are solo authored by women are actually down relative to 2019. So while the pandemic has benefited men's publishing overall, publications by women have been negatively affected, and they've been particularly negatively affected in health and medicine, physical sciences and engineering, and social sciences and economics. There's also an interesting irony in here that women with more seniority have been more strongly affected negatively by the publication sort of gap, which probably has to do with who's having babies and when. and the inability to publish when you've got small children at home, doing remote learning and Zooming and all of that. So a positive, at least, is that the rate of acceptance once an article is submitted is the same as it has been. It's still at baseline. So the issue really is a generation of the work itself. So I want to say just a little bit on this, because I think there's a tendency to understand this issue as one of just simple fairness. Like, it's not fair that women are disproportionately picking up the load at home and therefore unable to advance their careers with publishing. And certainly that's true because publications factor into promotion and tenure. So to the extent that women are hampered in publishing because of a pandemic, there's going to be a shadow effect where women are also less represented in positions of leadership in academic and scientific institutions. But there's an actual sort of like a kind of patient or epistemological effect here, which is that insofar as the conversations about science and medicine and COVID are being largely shaped by the male perspective, they are necessarily lacking in the kinds of things that women generally think about or in the life experiences that women bring to that conversation. So here's just a small anecdotal example. So I think back to the very early days of the pandemic, when a lot of authors were postulating that children couldn't get or transmit COVID. You kind of all remember that from like March and April. And so as a mom, my first thought when reading that was, well, they're just all at home. That's why, that's why it looks like that. That's why they're not in the hospital. My children are in my family room while I'm trying to teach. That's why they're not giving anybody COVID. And so, it's not so much that they're not biologically capable of being vectors. And as they've returned to school, we've seen that that's true, that they, clearly are capable of being vectors. So I think also secondarily about the conversation around the Johnson & Johnson vaccine, which obviously is very front and center right now. And that this too raises issues of gender equity in publishing. So all 6 of the people who have experienced blood clots from the Johnson & Johnson vaccine were women of childbearing age. And as a woman of childbearing age, I would really like a woman to be part of the conversation, not only as to what might be the underlying cause of those clots, but also as to what is ethical and appropriate in terms of mitigating the risk. So with all of that in mind, I think I bring you sort of my broad conclusions, which is that certainly all the time, but definitely during COVID, we've seen a need to balance the publication speed with the ethical obligations of authorship. And this is an interesting thing to consider when we also back up into the pre-COVID times and think about how the slow process of publication has actually been kind of a problem for some researchers. And then we need to engage in early conversations regarding authorship order, responsibilities, and expectations for members of your research team, including your students, and employ a model of inclusion in collaboration and publication that rewards and encourages participation rather than engaging in sort of gamesmanship and sort of petty academic concerns. So I think with that, I have met my treats obligation of short and sweet. And I will turn it over to questions if people have them. Oh, Colin has one.
Hi, thank you for that lovely talk. I have 2 questions. One of them is more, I'm hoping you could say a little bit more in detail about, and that is the shepherding function. I'm not familiar with that. That sounds very interesting to me, but I'm wondering what the nitty gritty is. Like, what does green, yellow, red actually tell us?
Oh. Yeah, so shepherdizing in law, as people with a law background know, when you cite a case in your brief or in your law review article, you want to make sure that you're citing something that's still good law, right? So you're not citing a case that's been overruled or overturned, or a case that has an appellate history that is really significant, so your case isn't good anymore. And so the green means that the case has been positively cited by subsequent cases. So it's a really good indication that the case that you're citing is okay to cite. The yellow means usually that it has negative treatment, some negative treatment. So then you can go through the cases that have cited that case and see what part of the case is being treated negatively, because a case might not be overruled in whole, right? It might have 3 holdings and 1 holding is overruled. And then the red means, wait a minute, you're about to cite something that has been completely disregarded, right? You're about to go with, Plessy versus Ferguson, and you might need to update your knowledge there. So, so I love that function in Westlaw, and there's a version of it, a little bit of a version of it on Google Scholar, which is that you can at least see who's cited that article, but it would be great if you could see much more history than that. And it should be possible. Anyway, we're off topic.
So to stay a little bit off topic maybe, but I do really like that idea. I think especially very jokingly in my writing group the other day, one of my friends was like, had submitted something that was kind of not her best work. And it was a little provocative more than maybe like well thought.
Yeah.
Like, well, I'll just save it until I get tenure and then I'll publish it and it'll get 1 million citations because everybody's going to hate it, And it does seem like citations, that is the only thing that Google Scholar really tracks as far as I know. And a lot of those, it's like with Twitter, you get ratioed. It's not a good, it's not a good index of whether this is useful information or not, or like worth citing if you're just kind of like reading the abstract.
Yeah, I agree with that. And I also think that one of the advantages of something like of shepherdizing in law is that you can find the original source really easily. So one of the problems I have found in academic publishing as a somewhat newbie, I guess, to this, relative to my practice in law anyway, is that what ends up getting cited is the thing that cited something else. And so you have to engage in this like back to find out, well, who's the person who developed this paradigm? And unless the paradigm's named after them, you might never find it.
Yeah, I think that's another really interesting aspect of the citation question too, because a lot of things on the med side of the world, there's a lot of reliance on lit reviews, which as far as I know, also don't give like citation points to like each time a lit review is cited.
Yeah.
Anyway, I do appreciate that. That's a little bit off topic, but I thought that was great and I wanted to hear more. The one that's more on topic of my questions is I'm wondering, when you're talking about the changing norms of authorship and who counts as an author, it made me think, like, what are we thinking is the point of getting your name as an author? What's that supposed to represent? Because there are really practical issues that you brought up at the very end in terms of like tenure case, et cetera. And I'm wondering if the norms of authorship are changing. Do you have a sense of whether the interpretation of what it means to be an author is also changing?
I do think the norms are changing. And I don't know at what point the Icmje will sort of fully embrace the fact that there's a shift. But I mean, I just noticed in the, I guess, sort of, I've worked in several sort of large collaborative teams. I mean, large for me, so like, 6 authors or so, right? Not on a physics project where there are 3,000. But there's a real sense of like what we each bring. And it's not all 4 things, right? Like there's the power writer, there's the idea person. I can't do statistics. I'm an English major. There's somebody on the team who's really, really good at numbers. And not only good at numbers, but good in like, they can look at it and things just pop out to her of like, oh, we got to talk about this. This is really cool. So she's indispensable, right? Even if she's not the strongest writer on the team. And I do think that there's, I think that's important. And I'm not trying to, be too sort of like participation trophies for everyone. I think that's a millennial problem, less a Gen X problem. Just kidding. But I think that teams are built around a collective group of talents and not everybody having the same strengths. So I do hope I just hope they kind of, think about that. There's when I teach, as you know, I always have the APA model of authorship, which assigns a certain number of points for your tasks on a project. And when you get up over a certain number of points, then you can call yourself an author. And I think that's a much more equitable and way to do it, and fits better with the way research teams actually function these days. Peter liked that answer.
So Jane, I'm driving, but that was a great talk. So thank you. So Jane, for promotion, they usually count first and the last authors as valuable. So can you talk on that a little bit as well?
Sure. So one of the nice things for me is that I like to write, and my bosses let me write, but my publications don't factor in heavily to my, there is no tenure, in this position necessarily. So I'm in a position where I get to observe a lot of that tension without any, real risk to me with it. But I've seen it play out with real sorts of, the only word that can come to mind is pettiness. I mean, I was involved in a research project in which one of the people on the team just sort of announced that they would be the mentor author. And that seemed not accurate to me in terms of the amount of work that had been put in. And the only thing that I could really say to myself was that I didn't follow my own rule of having the conversation at the front end about the order of authorship. And, if I'm telling people to do that, I should probably do it myself. And so it's kind of, did I want to really have the fight about it, or did I want to just sort of learn and move on? But I think this is something I actually remember Peter saying a few years ago, that there also probably needs to be not just a penalty for underpublishing, but a sort of heightened scrutiny of clear overpublishing. So if you've got somebody whose name is on like 32 manuscripts in a year, like that's probably a red flag that like, is that really what's going on? And what is that person doing that they have, 32 publications? And just as an aside too, even though this wasn't necessarily asked of me, I do think that the overemphasis on publication, and I'll call it an overemphasis on publication in academia, results in not always enough attention on quality of teaching, which is the first and fundamental purpose of a university. Like that's its 1,000-year-old mission. So I wish that I wish that there were a little bit less of that, but have the conversation up front because it matters. There's no question it matters these days. Does that answer your question, Zainab?
Yes, it does. So I have another question. I'm sorry for the sound. I'm driving. So Jane, what is the? So I have two questions. One is, what if person? Actually, she was one of my mentees. So she did a study. She had the idea. She worked for it. She collected the data, but then she did not write it up. I mean, we contacted her several times. She said she was going to do it, but she never did it. So what to do with that? So can we just write it up and tell her that she could contribute as she wants to? But she has the idea. She got the data. So yeah. So can you talk a little bit on that?
She's your mentee, right? So you're the mentor author on that. So I think you send her an email and you say, hey, If I don't hear back from you in a week or 2 weeks or whatever, we're going to move on with this project without you. And then if she doesn't want to write it up or doesn't indicate a response, then either you or a new mentee can write it up and you put her in an acknowledgement section. And so she generated the data and she generated the design, but she didn't do the write-up and she doesn't apparently want to be accountable for the final project. I'd be careful with that particular project, because one of the things I'd be nervous about was somebody who has sort of ghosted you on a data-driven project. Are they nervous about their data? Like, what makes them drop a project like this? I mean, maybe they dropped the project because they got really busy and life is really busy right now. But, I guess you're welcome. Thank you. But there are probably some other reasons there too. But no, I think you give the project to somebody else and they write it up and they're an author and she's not.
Okay, Jane, that's great. And one last question. What if let's say 3, 4, or 2 authors cannot agree on who's going to be the first, second, or third, whatever? Is there a certain place that they can go for consultation?
Yeah, so there's not a place they can go for consultation, but one way to get around that is to name your research group. And so you can be the whatever team, the Tigers or something like that. I don't know. Give yourself a nice acronym. And then you publish as a group and the members of the group are listed alphabetically rather than in order of seniority. So that's kind of a way to skirt the issue. The other thing to do that I found is that if it's a team that's going to produce multiple manuscripts, you can rotate authorship. I've done that before. I have a colleague that we sort of switch back and forth, and that works well for us. Yeah, so I think those would be my 2 solutions. And I noticed that Peter unmuted himself. And so I think he has either something to add or to debate in terms of some of the suggestions I've offered.
I love the questions, Zainab, and I love the answers, Jane. That's not a debate issue. But I'll for each of them, maybe do the second one first. That's first in my mind. And I'd say about that is part of the lesson of this talk and what I was taught early on by Kim Quaid, who gave a previous version of a talk on authorship, who said basically there are 2 types of people in academia, those who've had an authorship dispute and those who will have one. So like with all relationships, there are fights. And so what you're describing, Zainab, is a case where you have to have it out. You have to have a discussion, always sooner rather than later. Like Jane said, one of her primary rules is to discuss authorship and authorship order at the very beginning. And when you can do that, that is essential. And if need be, you have to be able to return to it and to do the hard work of a relationship. And so I like what she said. I like the also idea there are certain ways out if you are at an impasse. So she's a good lawyer and a good negotiator. She says, here's a good compromise you can come up with, including rotating authorship and or naming your writing group and avoiding having a first author. Some journals will actually let you define the corresponding author as more than one person. I recently found out very late in the process that the journal we were submitting to would not let us have more than one corresponding author. So that did not solve our problem. But again, it's a relationship issue, right? And I've learned that. And I see Jane actually looks like she wants to say something else about that case before I do the student who disappeared case. Are you good, Jen? You want to add to that?
Yeah, no, I'm fine.
Yeah, no, I was going to say also, about the fights over authorship, and I've lost it now. I would say that, yeah, exactly. The patient disappeared case, the student disappeared case, Zainab, again, I'm very interested in that case because, as you said, you're waiting for her to write. She or he, they are not doing the writing. Time is passing. Maybe they've moved on. It sounds like they're not available to you anymore. And I agree with Jane's suggestion to reach out and say, look, this is the situation. We want to get these things into print, and somebody else can write this. The question I have for Jane is, I would guess, and you can tell me if I'm wrong about this, the ethics is this individual, by not writing, has not forfeited her ability to be an author, right? It's still on the table for her to be an author. She generated the idea, she collected the data, she's got a lot of effects. And so it seems almost an ethical obligation to say, look, if you're willing to engage in the writing as, providing critical input and taking responsibility, the other steps, then you can still be an author. We can talk about order, and if you don't write it, you probably won't be the first author. But you're still invited to be an author. I don't like I think it almost sounds like freezing out to say you failed to write it, so now it's not even on the table. I won't offer you the opportunity to fulfill the other criteria.
I completely agree with you, Peter. No, I absolutely agree. I'm thinking more in terms of the student who just doesn't respond to the email. Like you send it out and they've ghosted you, right? And so they're not responding, they're not interested, they're not, whatever. But that's the thing that makes me really nervous.
I like what you said too about the nervousness, to actually, again, make it clear in a non-judgmental way to say, we're going to publish this. I need to know now any concerns you have about this data, because I feel very uncomfortable going forward. If you had any concerns, please let me know, try to make it a safe sort of conversation. Obviously, if there's been misconduct, some kind of, faking of data, I'm not sure she's going to open up to you about that. And there are dangers there, I guess. So, as always.
What's up, Colin?
Yeah, so I love that case too. I think that's such an interesting question, in part because I think there's two different dimensions to why it's troublesome. One is a question of data ownership, which I do think is very different from authorship,
Yes.
but is related.
Yeah.
And then the other part is the question, going along with what Peter was saying, of analysis and contribution, which I do think is, like, these things are different, but it's very different. For me, personally, it seems inappropriate to think that just because a specific researcher collected the data that they have a say in the public, or how that data are used by other members of the team, especially if they disappeared. But I would be interested to hear what you think about that.
I think ownership issues are super interesting in authorship. And I mean, this is something I talk more about when we teach this in class, but yeah, so like, who owns the data, I think is absolutely an interesting question. And I think if the data, one way to make, I think if the data is produced as the result of a group idea, right? The group owns the data, regardless of like who did the interviews or who, whatever, sat in the lab and watched the values, whatever it is that is happening. If the group conceived of the idea, then the group owns the data. But there are a lot of, and I don't know if I haven't looked up into whether or not there's a sort of consensus about how that ownership issue goes. And actually, now I'm thinking of my own paper, because I bet there are lawsuits about it. So there's probably a legal answer somewhere shepherdized on Westlaw. But the other thing that's really interesting about ownership that I've run into is, as a clinical ethicist, is when I create products for clinics to use in order to sort of obviate an ethical problem. So, hey, we're going to use this particular consent form, or you're going to start sending out this letter, or here's an infographic I've developed for you, whatever. And then IU Health owns that graphic or that letter, and I want to use it to publish, right? Because like I came up with the idea. And I think, fortunately, I work for a friendly enough institution that they're not going to, complain too much about that. But you can imagine something like that if you worked for the clinic or something, and then suddenly the director of the clinic wants to say they own it, or they want to publish about it, and it's, that sort of thing. So the way Ken Pimple talks about ownership, he equates it very closely to plagiarism, and I actually think the issue is much, much bigger than that.
I mean, the analogies between authorship and ownership are really analogical as well as direct and material, as you're describing. And the whole idea of an author, of course, is a bit outdated now that we do this work with teams. Maybe it was never inundated. That, the idea that somebody or some group of people are responsible for the work is kind of the core notion, I think, of authorship. Maybe that's simplistic. But now, the work is so diffuse, and our understanding of who creates work is more diffuse. But the idea of again, I think it's gendered, right? The great man, the great genius or great woman who's come up with the idea. I think with the better understanding of how knowledge is produced, the idea of author has exactly changed. The way you said, Jen, I loved your question, or maybe it was a question after you spoke, about when has the custom changed. So now we're recognizing a change in what should be counted as an author in a field, and when is it just being misused, right? It's sort of like grammar, right? When people speak in a new way, it's just ungrammatical. But once everybody's speaking that way, it's just a new way of speaking, and it becomes the accepted grammar. Colin, don't listen to any of that. It's not informed by any true knowledge of linguistics. But that's my understanding from a layman perspective. And what Jane was saying about authorship, it seems similar. Like, hey, are they misusing the notion of authorship in physics, or have they changed the notion? Well, at some point they changed it. Are we misusing it in precision health? I think so still. Or have we changed it? And of course, the issue there is what are you indicating when you call somebody an author? I'll say this last thing before I let you jump back in, because now the chat is exploding, which, as you know, I cannot handle because I'm not Gen X or Gen Z. I think I'm Gen X, actually.
Gen
I'm not a
X.
boomer. I'm just after boomers. Anyway, so what I was going to say was, now I've lost it. Oh, I was going to say this. Annals of Internal Medicine has you list for each author what exactly they did.
Yeah.
And so the idea is it's just a group. If you really want to know what the person did and how much they own the idea and the product, then you should look at that end of the paper where it says exactly what they did.
More journals are doing that too, saying just tell us what you did. Just tell, list your contribution. And I think that's actually a pretty decent way to do things. It also creates accountability within the group. It's sort of like when I have to draft my end of the month reports on what I did, I'm like, oh boy, not enough. That's what I did, was not enough this month. So, but I think to your other point, Peter, about the sort of old school model of authorship, I read one article in anticipation of today's talk, and now I can't remember which one it was, that walked through that really like old school sense of authorship of like before computers, when you're writing it on a legal pad and passing it around and then somebody types it up. And just sort of as a practical matter, you didn't have what you have now of like a Google Doc that people are jumping in and jumping out of and making comments on the side. And that just was obviously not the way people worked. So there was a sort of like, the sense of the author as the person who literally put pen to paper and wrote the thing. Colin has a question here. IP analysis ownership as a literal form of ownership is difficult. I think it's very difficult, which is why I'm not an IP lawyer.
So Jane, that was a great talk. I have a comment. Years ago, actually, I had to come to Kimberly, Kim Quaid to consult her on this. So it's difficult when you are working with a totally different department, like school. I was working with a medical sociology group, and they said at the time they could only publish with one author, not more than that. And I said, I'm the PI on this project, and I can make some meaningful contribution. And plus, I really need the publication too. But they said for our world, we can only have one on certain papers. We can have only one author. So that was tough. And actually, unfortunately, it wasn't helpful to me in the end. I wish I had just kept my silence. Yeah. I really wish I did. I totally regret that now. So my lesson is that maybe, as you said, it's better to set the rules at the beginning, at least get in the rules of each department. Yeah. You can back off or maybe just say, all right, fine, whatever you want to do. But do you want to comment on that? Or have you ever seen anything like that?
Yeah, oh, definitely. So here's the way I see it as somebody who works both with doctors and scientists, and my academic home is in the School of Liberal Arts. And so one of the things that has come up for me and for some of my colleagues who also sort of bridge that gap is really requesting from our school, our home, that they be flexible in their evaluation of the way they accord priority in authorship. So what I mean by that is that if the School of Liberal Arts, when they're looking at promotion and tenure, has a sort of hard and fast rule that only the first two authors on a paper matter, they need to understand that, for example, their comm studies department is using first and last author as the privileged author spots. And so they're actually not capturing what they want to capture. And so are they really trying to enforce some draconian rule about first and second author? Or are they trying to evaluate who are their heavy hitters of publication? And if they're trying to do that, then they're actually going to need to use more than one methodology for that evaluation. And I think as we get more into sort of interdisciplinary collaborative work, which I have never worked anywhere other than IU academically, but IU seems to do a lot of, schools are going to have to be flexible on that, or they're actually not going to be correctly evaluating their own people. So, so that's kind of how I've seen it.
Yeah, yeah. Great. Thank you, Jane.
Thank you, Zainab. It's good to see you again.
The field of philosophy had a lot of problems with this too, Jane. That they hated multiple authored works. They felt that you didn't know who had done it. You know, they wanted the ownership thing. They wanted to know, I get to peg this to this person. However, one of the greatest philosophers of the 20th century, Ludwig Wittgenstein, when he wrote one of his most important works, said, I have no idea where I got these ideas. I got them from all over the place. People said them to me. I just don't remember where they came from. So don't give me credit. It's all these different people I can't even list here. Again, just the part of authorship, which is in some ways difficult because it doesn't really fit the real world where ideas come from all over and there's no one generator of them. Okay, in the absence of more questions, Jane, final comments? Outstanding, perfect, the perfect treat talk. This is
Have a beautiful weekend.
Yeah, we will
Thank
all
you.
try.
It was good
Bye
to
all.
see you all.
Bye-bye. Thanks, Jane.